This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, guest host Dr. Anthony Eames, Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Reagan Institute, speaks with Dr. James Cooper, Associate Professor in History and American Studies at York St. John University in the United Kingdom. Anthony and James spoke about the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, as well as broader U.S. U.K. relations.
Hello, I'm Anthony Eames, Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm serving as your guest host today, and I'm pleased to welcome James Cooper from York St. John's University in the United Kingdom to talk about his new book, A Diplomatic Reading, Reagan, Thatcher, and the Art of Symmetry. James is a associate professor at York St. John's University. He has been a Fulbright scholar, a fellow at the Royal Historical Society, and has written quite a bit on the Reagan-Thatcher relationship. James, great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you ever so much for having me, Anthony.
And James, you go by Jim, so we can call you Jim, correct?
Yeah, call me Jim, please.
Okay.
If you call me James, I think I'm in trouble. So,
So Jim, I think you have an interesting take on our friends Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that probably doesn't conform with the conventional wisdom about their relationship. And I just want to ask you, are they political soulmates or not?
yeah, it's a great question to kick off with. I think Reagan and Thatcher are always seen in terms of probably popular debate or how we think about Anglo-American relations in that sort of tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy and Harold Macmillan, and you get Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and then of course you get Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, George W. Bush's examples, this kind of special relationship between the American president and the British Prime Minister. And Reagan and Thatcher is very much seen as kind of the high point of this in many ways. You get this coming together, these conservative philosophies, commonalities in conservative philosophy, sharing of them all, free market economics, almost a new right emerges in the 70s and the 80s. They're kind of very much seen as big leaders of this. But actually, if you look closely at it all, they're not really the same. Often they're seen to be like Reagan and Thatcher, they're the same. Reaganism and Thatcherism are the same kind of thing. But actually it's not the case. And that's often because, maybe they probably have the same shared philosophy of maybe smaller government, the importance of free markets, the importance of incentives for taxation policy, the importance of having what Reagan would call sound money in terms of lowering inflation, the importance of standing up to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. How those philosophies played out across either side of the Atlantic happened very differently. And that's because of institutional differences, political differences and so on. But also, ultimately, these are two politicians who have their own interests at heart. And sometimes those interests kind of collided as well.
Right. And so you kind of walk us through the relationship a bit before they become prime minister and president, respectively. Something we don't hear too much about. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher actually knew each other in the 1970s, maybe even earlier, it seems. Can you tell us a little bit about how they got to know each other, why it seemed like their philosophies of governance might be aligned, and how they actually didn't seem to be so in the end?
Well, the first time Thatcher claimed she heard about Ronald Reagan was Reagan delivers a speech at the Institute of Directors over here in the UK, and her husband Dennis was there, and he came home and was raving and saying how wonderful Ronald Reagan was, who then was governor of California. And so she, according to her memoir, so her looking back, of course, in hindsight, made a point to keep a note of this and look out for Ronald Reagan. And Thatcher goes over to the United States as a junior member of Parliament in the 1960s on a tour to meet congressional leaders and State Department things. So that's kind of a common thing. And obviously, the U.S. Congress, Congress people go over, don't representatives go for tours of the world like China or Europe and visit, to speak with their counterparts and fact-finding missions and so on. So Thatcher did that kind of thing. But in 1975, she's elected leader of the Conservative Party. And in many respects, she's elected to lead the Conservative Party because she wasn't Ted Heath, who was her predecessor. So she's very much a leap in the dark for the Conservative Party, the faith of the MPs and then the party members and so on. And she was having a bit of difficulty establishing her own political identity. So even though she was much more interested in domestic affairs, she undertook a series of foreign trips to kind of add some extra gravitas and expose her to foreign affairs, have her been photographed meeting world leaders. So it's a bit like when presidential nominees in an election year, they always have their trip to Europe. So I remember Barack Obama came over to give a speech in Berlin and came to London. I remember Mitt Romney coming over as well, meeting the Prime Minister and his opposition. It's all about being seen to be a statesperson in waiting, get to know people, and so on. So Thatcher did that, and when she undertook that, she didn't actually meet Reagan then, but she did meet President Gerald Ford. And of course, she writes to Gerald Ford saying how wonderful he is, and how the world needs a strong America and that kind of thing. And also, when she meets the US members of the US Congress, all very impressed with her, and apparently people are passing notes saying, "Can we please take her over here? If things don't work out in Britain, we'd love to have her run for president," so on. But Reagan, he also at the same year, he actually comes over in 1972, a few years previously. No, 75. He comes over in 75, and he meets Margaret Thatcher then as well. But he meets her twice as well in the 70s. So one visit they meet, but the second visit, the first visit, and this might be the do-over. The first visit they meet, I think it's during the early 1970s when Reagan is an emissary for Richard Nixon. He's kind of coming over to meet world leaders on Nixon's behalf, and Thatcher apparently has dinner with Reagan and with lots of other people. In 1978, Ronald Reagan comes over to the UK as very much a private citizen, and he meets with and he wants to meet kind of world leaders and dignitaries. And the Labour government only basically offer a meeting with a junior minister, who goes on to speak up the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Roy Hattersley. But Margaret Thatcher, who's in the lead of the opposition 3 years into it, she meets Ronald Reagan. She makes time for him. Because obviously she's met with Gerald Ford. Ford has lost. She's met with Jimmy Carter as leader of the opposition. And she's probably got a good political antennae. She could probably know that Jimmy Carter's probably going to, he's not looking good for him in terms of re-election. So she's thinking Ronald Reagan, the favourite for the Republican nomination in 1980. And also she remembers the fact that, he's just up her street, as we would say in the UK. Similar talks that she does, and espouses a similar philosophy as she does. So they have a good meeting. It's meant to be a short meeting. It goes on for over an hour. And then, of course, he's elected. She's elected Prime Minister, and he's elected as President. When she's elected as Prime Minister, he tries to get a message sent through to her, but the British Civil Service don't care. They don't really prioritise a message from the former governor of California, defeated presidential candidate. They're not really interested. When he's elected as president, apparently her message of congratulations is read out at the victory party. It's made sure that that's handed to the president-elect. Also, when Reagan in the late 70s doing his talk shows, he was keeping his political brand alive, his presence alive, doing his talk radio show and his public speaking. He talks about Margaret Thatcher as well in that, especially when she's elected as Prime Minister. He talks about our Maggie will go on and kind of sort out Britain and try to reverse British decline. So they are aware of each other. And Thatcher writes in a memoir that when Reagan's elected, she kind of waxes lyrical that finally the United States, this beacon of hope for the world, has got the leader that it needs to, reverse, Western decline and stand up to communism and get the economy going again. So they are very much aware of each other and what each other stands for. And that happens, of course, just by chance, Dennis Thatcher hearing Reagan speak, Thatcher remembers it. But what I will say is that these visits, Reagan's obviously doing his visits to kind of make sure he's still a presence in American politics, to show us so the photographs can be sent at home, that he's still a national figure. And so we can go into the Republican campaign in 1980 saying, I have met world leaders, I've met national figures and so on. And Thatcher's going to the United States. And as I said, she kind of praised Gerald Ford when she was there. She really tried to make a real effort with Jimmy Carter and was nice to him, although it was very much picked up on their advisors, picked up those tensions between the two. So whoever was the American president, Thatcher was going to be trying to be close to. But her and Reagan certainly hit it off in terms of that broad philosophy and worldview.
Jim, you said events do matter. Some of those events that brought Reagan and Thatcher to power seem to have a kind of eerie similarity to the events we're facing today. Inflation seems to be the thing that's on everyone's mind, at least in the United States. At least in the United States. I suspect also in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how they tackled inflation. And here it seems that you're finding some daylight between the two, even though I've been told from the time I was old enough to read history to the present day that they tackled it the same way. But you seem to have a different take on that. And just remember that I'm not an economist. Mm-hmm. So if you could kind of keep it at, a reader accessible, listener accessible level for me to understand how they tackled inflation.
Well, I'm not an economist either, so I try to avoid. I always try to kind of avoid the real nitty-gritty of economic theory. But so certainly in my first book, there's lots of footnotes about economic theory. If people really want to get into the weeds of this thing, but I think in terms of inflation, how they tackle inflation, there's three things to consider. The first, of course, there's institutional differences in how they do this and how they can do this. So for Reagan, he doesn't really necessarily in terms of have any control over monetary policy. It's the Federal Reserve. So it's Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve. And Paul Volcker, of course, was a Jimmy Carter appointee. And of course, they're implementing a monetarist, the theory of the day, Milton Friedman's theory of the day. In the UK, up until 1997, when Tony Blair's government comes in, we didn't have an independent central bank. So the government would set interest rates and therefore control monetary policy and so on. So Thatcher is kind of directly having a say over inflation and monetary policy, like her predecessors have. Whereas for Reagan, it's more the Federal Reserve kind of controlling this. For Thatcher, for how the British tackle inflation, they use high interest rates. They raise interest rates to reduce the money supply. And Thatcher is very interested in different types of money. And I remember I was interviewing a great economist, Owen Stelter, years ago, and he made the comment to me that when he first met Margaret Thatcher, she said to him, do you look at M0 or M1 or M2? There's different types of money. And you can never imagine Ronald Reagan asking a question like that. So Thatcher took a big interest in this, and they use high interest rates to lower the inflation. So you have a lot of my parents tell me stories about interest rates for like 16%, and you don't know you're born, that kind of stuff. We're worried about like going to 1.5% interest rates over here, which still hurts. I mean, the times change and circumstances change. But in America, of course, it's Paul Volcker's Fed. And my understanding of the American monetary policy was that the high interest rates were a result of the limiting of the money supply. So in Britain, we used the high interest rates to slow the control money supply. Whilst in America, the interest rates went up because of their efforts to control the money supply, so monetary-based control. That's my understanding of the key differences. And then so really that's not necessarily Reagan and Thatcher differences, kind of institutional differences. But the main thing is that Milton Friedman, I don't think he was very impressed with what anyone did. Milton Friedman, he sent, I think in 1980 or 81, he sent a testimony into the House of Commons Select Committee looking at economic policy. And he said not even a Rip Von Winkle would do what you'd be doing in my theory. He's just kind of like really slammed what Thatcher had done in terms of, in his name really, in monetarism. It's a bit like how people would say how Karl Marx would have been appalled with what people have done in his name in Soviet Union, that kind of things. It's a terrible comparison, but it's basically the theorist is like, what have you done? So in some ways in Britain it's been the idea that rather than a Milton Friedman kind of a gradual slow down of money supply, it was more like a Hayekian, Frederick von Hayek, a different economic theory, more like a short, sharp shock to the system, which happened in Britain, of course. And the big thing for this, in terms of politics, is that when Ronald Reagan comes into power in 1981, his administration are very keen to stress that there are differences between Reaganism and Thatcherism, because I think it's the Washington Post, there's an editorial which says that there's concerns that Reaganism or Reaganomics will lead to Thatcheritis. there's a sense that actually Ronald Reagan's taken us where Britain is. And Britain has like 3-4 million unemployed in 1981. So when Margaret Thatcher makes her first visit to the United States as Prime Minister, she's the first major world leader to go to the Reagan White House. I think she's the second leader technically. I think the South Korean leader goes there first, but I think in fact she's the first major leader. So on the one hand, they're talking the same language about small government, sound money, getting inflation down, economic growth, Cold War, setting up Soviet Union, that kind of stuff. Well, that's going on. Donald T. Reagan is actually at the House Representatives at a select committee or at the committee hearing, saying that, oh no, what we're going to do is different to what Margaret Thatcher's done. And there's a memorandum circulated into the press outlining the difference between Reaganism and Thatcherism. And this leads to Geoffrey Howe, Thatcher's Chancellor of the Exchequer, to have an exchange with Donald Reagan, and I think they're basically saying, why are you being mean about our economic policy? We need to stick together. We're friends. And Howe even offers to send over a senior civil servant to, have FaceTime and talk with Reagan's team about this. So there are differences how they approach it, and it was that again that kind of the Soulmates go back to your first question. They're trying to promote this idea that almost basically Margaret Thatcher can now say, I'm having a hard time domestically, unemployment's high, I'm getting criticised. At one point, I think it's like 188 top economists write to the Times newspaper slamming her policy. She can now say, well, I'm not crazy. I'm not wrong because Ronald Reagan's doing the same thing. And Ronald Reagan's saying, well, I'm going to, just like Margaret Thatcher, we're going to, reduce the size of government, restore our belief in people, like all that kind of stuff. But actually, at the same time, his team are distancing themselves from Margaret Thatcher. So it's actually quite a complicated thing in terms of, I suppose, like the PR message they're giving, but also the reality as well.
Reaganomics, Thatcherism, inflation today. Do you see any of those solutions being applied today? I mean, could they even work in the same way? How would that play out in your eyes?
I'm not sure I'm qualified. But I think as a historian, obviously someone who's looked at the last kind of 10, 15 years of economic crisis, because we've had economic crises now for 15 years. We never really got over the 2007, 2008 period. And I think from what I can tell, and again, I'm sure there might be listeners who won't be, maybe very unhappy with disagree strongly, but it seems to me that central banks are coming printing money with quantitative easing. And there's a lot of money supply happening. And then we've had very low interest rates. We've then had to spend obviously huge amounts of government taxpayers' money in terms of, for the pandemic, to deal with the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. So in some ways, my worry as just someone who has a mortgage and a family is the cupboard bare in terms of what do you do next? Whereas of course Reagan, in terms of Reaganomics, in some ways actually you could make the argument that he's almost like a supply-side economics, almost like a neo-Keynesian. That it actually was deficit financing, that rather than spending the money on big government projects, you would cut taxes to increase the economic growth. So the deficit actually helped. Similarly, kind of like it's almost like a reverse version of Keynes in some way. But I don't think we've got the capacity to borrow any more money. And obviously, the high inflation we have, you kind of got to hope that it kind of like works itself out somehow. But my fear is that there is an argument actually the economic growth that happened in the 80s under Reagan and Thatcher and the decline of the inflation which they oversaw and ultimately the lowering of interest rates, it happened because of a recession. And ultimately the idea that recessions based kind of, for the want of a better phrase, kind of sweat inflation out of the economy. You almost have to do that to get rid of inflation. And that's obviously a terrible thing that you don't wish anybody. And I think therefore it goes back in some ways to what I would argue is Margaret Thatcher's, in some ways, the key economic political change she brought is that in the British context, unemployment was the deal breaker in terms of your political fortunes. But actually, the idea if you had like 1 million, 2 million unemployed, there was no way you were going to get re-elected. There's no way at all. But Thatcher got re-elected in 1983 despite high unemployment, despite the economic hardship of people. And that's because she brought inflation down. So it's almost the idea if you bring down actually the cost of living is key in terms of inflation and interest rates. And that unemployment is tolerable politically. So obviously in terms of the American context, in terms of monetary supply, inflation, interest rates, the president doesn't really, I suppose, is depending on the good humour of the central bank, depending on the chair of the Federal Reserve, and obviously morning again, the American 984 happens, where obviously the midterms, the Republicans have a bit of a hard time because of the economy. But after about a year, 18 months, the economy is picking back up again. Maybe there's been a loosening of the monetary supply by the federal bank and helping that recovery happen as well. So, yeah, in terms of, I think it's very different circumstances to the 70s and the 80s. I think because of the financial position we probably found ourselves in since 2007, we've probably never really recovered from that. That'd be my very layperson's perspective. But so I don't know what Reagan and Thatcher would do now, but I'm not quite sure they could do what they did that way.
Well, that's what we're here to try to figure out on the podcast. But we have plenty of other friends who can help us work through those ideas too. We've talked a little bit about economics as kind of the big issue that Reagan and Thatcher confronted at the start of their terms in office. But there's some other big issues they were confronting that you point out in your book. And one of those is the Americas, and what's going on in the Americas, and what's going on in America's backyard. Falklands War, the invasion of the Grenada, all sorts of kind of hotspots that have a unique relationship to both the United States and the United Kingdom. It doesn't seem like they're on the same footing all the time on these issues. This seems to be a big part of your book, that there's some real daylight on when and where to exercise military power, when and where to make a show of British or American strength, and how that actually might affect the kind of bigger grand strategic calculus in confronting the Cold War enemy, number one, the Soviet Union. So tell me a little bit about those two hotspots we just brought up, Grenada and the Falklands War.
Well, again, I think it goes back to the idea of interest, doesn't it? We can talk about the special relation in terms of does the president and the prime minister get on? Are they friendly? Do they have a shared worldview of philosophy? Ultimately, they are politicians and have got to put their own interests first. And in terms of the Falklands War, of course, Thatcher saw it through very much the prism of, the Falklands is British, and the Falkland Islanders want to remain British, and therefore this invasion cannot stand, and we're going to take the Falklands back. Now, for a lot of people, they were still surprised that Britain had a navy. So I think there was that kind of element. Oh wow, we still got a navy. That's cool. So obviously, the Reagan administration were divided on this, and that's because of the also Argentina. I mean, the military, the junta. The junta, and they weren't communists, and so very much the idea that actually we can't, the Reagan doctrine as it becomes is that we can't, we want to prevent, the spread of communism, especially in our backyard, and we want to roll back communism, and we cannot tolerate, another Cuba effectively. We don't want more communist countries in our hemisphere. And there was concerns with the Reagan administration that if the British won in the Falklands, the military junta would collapse and you'd end up with the Peronists. Not kind of like the singing Happy Evita Peronist kind of thing, but actually the communists would come in and take over. And that was seen to be a very, very bad thing. So there's a big divide here where do we kind of like back up, the Argentinian government or the military junta who aren't communists and make sure they don't fall, or do we take a risk that the communists come in? But by doing so, we upset perhaps our close ally in Europe, Margaret Thatcher. And this is why Alexander Haig tries to sort out a peace deal, Jean Kirkpatrick's at the UN trying to stop this from happening. But ultimately, I think Caspar Weinberger, he ends up kind of being very much in favour of British, sharing intelligence and so on. But ultimately, it comes down to, again, the reality is that the Navy's on its way. So is Reagan going to order the American Navy to stop the British Navy? So it's kind of like a fait accompli. It's happening. So basically that's to make it, do we just kind of like stay neutral, not get involved at all? Or do we actually just basically get involved, but basically ask the British not to humiliate the Argentinians? and make sure that agreement can happen quickly, and that's really what happens. So also, but when it comes to Falklands War, of course, this debate within the Reagan administration, of course, it's clear that what side of thing they fall down on. And there's a big relief when Reagan delivers his speech in Westminster on June the 8th, in 1982. And he's talking really about the Cold War, really talking about, it's this visionary speech where it's really the first major Western leader to say that the Cold War will end. The Cold War can be won. We're not going to be in this bipolar, divided world forever. But within that speech, he talks about the Falklands and how actually, these British boys aren't fighting for mere real estate. They're actually fighting for freedom and sovereignty and all that stuff. And so Margaret Thatcher, according to British press, she's almost got tears in her eyes. She's relieved that Ronald Reagan came out publicly endorsed the Falklands War. But it's interesting, as soon as the war comes to an end, it's very much the Reagan administration is very keen on this, that we need to sort this out for the long term. We don't want this to happen again. We don't want to humiliate the Argentinians. But also it's weird, if you look at the records of the meeting, which I'm sure you have, Nancy, it's just there's attempts by Thatcher at humour in these meetings. I remember there's this bizarre comment talking about using sheep to look for landmines. It's just really bizarre kind of. So she's got this weird attempts at humour in there, which is very Thatcher-like, really. But
she was many things, pleased. Maybe not a comedian.
Yeah, but she's very pleased with her victory. She's very kind of she's not on a high. So the opposite of the Falklands happens, and of course that's very much connected to Grenada when of course Grenada had the Americans invasion or intervention in Grenada. There's frustration that Thatcher didn't support it because the Americans supported the British when it came to Grenada. But again, in many ways, the context is a bit different where, of course, the story of Grenada is, basically get the deputy prime minister, basically kills the prime minister of Grenada. She almost goes from this kind of Marxist government to more extreme Marxist government. But they're a member of the British Commonwealth. And so the United States invades one of the Queen's possessions, to put it crudely, without consulting the British government, which was, it's a bit embarrassing for Thatcher. I mean, she's humiliated. The leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock at the time, he says so much for your special relationship. You weren't even consulted on all this. But it's such a surprise that I think Geoffrey Howe in his memoirs, at this point probably the Foreign Secretary, so the Secretary of State in American terms, he says how actually a lot of people in the British government didn't even know where Grenada was until this actually happened. We couldn't find it on a map. But actually, suddenly it's a big deal. But Thatcher, she's embarrassed, she's humiliated because she's certainly, say, the 83 election campaign, which is re-elected. There's footage of her and Reagan together. It's a big message that finally we've got a British Prime Minister who's taken seriously by world leaders, including the American president. She makes a big deal about, Ronald Reagan's here, we're friends, we're allies, we're in this together. And suddenly he just does something without consulting her. So, he writes in these diaries, Reagan does, doesn't he, that she telephones him, she's very unhappy about this talk of invasion, asks him not to do anything. And he can't tell her. He says, I didn't have the heart to tell her it had already happened. So, of course, then he makes the famous phone call where he calls to apologise for all this. And it's quite interesting. I think it's what I would say to my students, that this conversation they have is actually a classic source to look at in terms of the audio and the document. If you read the document, Thatcher's she doesn't say anything, which is very unlike Margaret Thatcher. She's very short, very kind of very bullet points, and he's very apologetic and so on. But the audio, I think she sounds a little bit more friendly. She kind of she's still warm to him. Probably she's just a bit embarrassed, disappointed. But with Grenada, of course, the big story for me in terms of Anglo-American relations that comes out of that is that they send the Deputy Secretary of State, Kenneth Dam, to meet with Thatcher and actually make a big effort after Grenada to constantly almost talk to her a lot. There's always someone talking to Margaret Thatcher. She feels like she's in the loop. When Dam goes to meet her in Downing Street, it's I think the MEMCOM, the memorandum of the meeting, I think the first 3 or 4 pages of notes are just her telling him off, just basically expressing her frustration that this had happened. Oh, well, it's done now. We have to move on. But she's clearly very, very unhappy that this happened. So, but they would the Americans have done something similar for another country? I don't know. You never know, but I'd like to know if everyone does know, then that'd be great to hear. But I think it does show that she was held in sufficient regard that they dispatched someone to essentially go and take a telling off. And he must have known on that plane what he was doing. He was very much taking one for Team Reagan, I think.
Well, from one backyard to another, Northern Ireland also seems to be a point of contention. There's some domestic politics for both countries at play there. More Catholics in Congress than at any point in American history when Reagan takes office, with a proud Catholic Speaker of the House and Tip O'Neill. Seems like a recipe for some tension in the relationship. Want to walk us through it?
Yeah, there was tension. I think that when it comes to Northern Ireland and the United States, I think the American president had always, throughout the Troubles, so from kind of like Johnson onwards, so Johnson, Ford, Nixon, they'd kind of stayed out of it. They hadn't really commented on it. And it's because of it, the nature of the American presidency is that it carries weight. You know, if the American president says something, it carries a lot of weight, it really matters. But you've always had, from the late 60s onwards, you had, people in Congress who were very unhappy what's happening in Northern Ireland. And you get two different groups emerge in Congress. You get the Four Horsemen, who are very much influenced by John Hume, who goes on, of course, for the Nobel Peace Prize for the Northern Ireland peace process in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And he's very much influenced people like Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, Daniel P. Moynihan, and Hugh Carey as the governor of New York. And they're very much kind of like pro, yes, they want there to be a settlement, and they want to use American power, economic influence to support that settlement. Whereas then you also have a group called, very much kind of, like led by Mario Di Biagio, is an Italian American from New York. He's much more of a firebrand critic of the British in Northern Ireland, and and there's some suggestion that based how he was taught was much more sympathetic to more basically get the British out of Ireland, almost like supporting the goals of the IRA. And so the British government were very kind of aware that what's happening in America is the interest in this issue, to the extent that in 1976 during the election campaign there, when Jimmy Carter, of course, he walks down in New York with the badge or lapel on him saying get the English out of Ireland, and he's pictured doing this. And then of course when he's clearly the nominee, a few days before the election, he meets with the Irish National Caucus, who basically want the British to get out of Ireland. And there's a panic in the Foreign Office about this. And the Foreign Office, so our State Department, if you will, end up speaking to the Carter campaign, and the British are reassured that no, a Carter presidency will not lead to demands that the British get out of leave Ireland, that kind of thing. So there was kind of on the agenda, and Jimmy Carter, because it essentially has to obviously work with Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy, his own kind of agenda as well, and because of his arrangements with them and support from them, Carter actually makes the first American president's declaration about Northern Ireland, promising financial support if a deal can be done, if something can be sorted here, and that's kind of what Ronald Reagan inherits. So you got the Kennedy, O'Neill and their group still wants there to be some sort of resolution, talk about some sort of settlement happening with the promise of American money to make that happen. Reagan, he doesn't really have much interest in the nuances of the issue, because obviously as far as he's concerned, it's the Cold War and tax cuts. That's what Reagan thinks, and he just sees it as very much a British issue. And he very much with Thatcher, he makes it quite clear to that he doesn't really want to interfere. Unfortunately, of course, you get the hunger strikes. There's other failings of trying to sort out a settlement there, and Thatcher seems to be increasingly intransigent, stubborn, not willing to even budge or try to work with the Irish government on this. And so Reagan comes under pressure to say something. Well, Tip O'Neill writes to Ronald Reagan and says basically, could you please raise this issue with Northern Ireland? Margaret Thatcher say we want to see some progress happening. And so Reagan, in some ways, I think Reagan's very underrated as a politician. And so what Reagan does it's Camp David in 1984. So I think that just talks about SDI. That's near the end. Excuse me. Ronald Reagan produces the letter from Tip O'Neill saying, the Speaker of the House asked me to raise this with you. So Reagan's not raising Northern Ireland with Margaret Thatcher. Tip O'Neill has raised it. And so Margaret Thatcher says, yes, I'll get on Gareth Fitzgerald, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, and we're always working towards a solution. And that's it. Reagan then writes to Tip O'Neill saying, I raised the issue of Margaret Thatcher. So we kind of like absolutely brilliant, really, in many respects. But I think the issue of Congress really comes to a head where Thatcher's meeting with Jimmy Carter in 1979, again, a lot of the meeting is taken up by the issue of guns and arms for the Royal Ulster Constabulary, where Tip O'Neill allows an amendment to go through, and I think the Defence Department budget or State Department budget, basically Mario Di Biagio, he wants there to stop the American arms sales to Northern Ireland, to Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police of Northern Ireland. And Tip O'Neill has to let it go through, because if he's talking about peace and that we shouldn't be sending money to the IRA and so on, we should stop American funds, the IRA, and everything for the IRA, he can't then say politically long and allow the Royal Ulster Constabulary to be using American weapons. So O'Neill feels he has to let this through. As Thatcher says to Jimmy Carter, you've got to, I'm really unhappy about this, and she even starts talking about how she loves that gun and it's better than British guns. And she goes through why she loves the gun. And he has to say, you have to talk to Tip O'Neill, because Carter does not want to get involved. He hasn't got the time to get involved with this, but he knows it's issue of Congress. So I think in terms of especially like, American foreign policy, Anglo-American relations and things, that actually it's not just about the presidency. There are other actors that really do have an impact on things. But ultimately, of course, there is the Anglo-Irish agreements in 1985, where a consultative mechanism is put in place more over Northern Ireland between the British and the Irish government. And Reagan, of course, he gets Tip O'Neill on board, and they make a statement, and there's going to be the Fund for Ireland. So basically, the American will be sent to help regenerate Northern, so almost delivering on what Jimmy Carter said would happen. But for Reagan, he writes the story that peace has come to Northern Ireland. So because that wasn't the case, I think it's more that Reagan was just, his focus was on maybe other things rather than what he saw as a very much a British domestic problem. So I think for Reagan and Thatcher, the tensions were very much between Thatcher and the Democrats in Congress. And I think Reagan was, navigating that quite smartly, really.
Well, that's pretty interesting. So we've dealt with some pretty heavy issues here. War, troubles, inflation. But maybe we could take a step back, get a little lighter, get a little more fun. Reagan's an Anglophile. Seems to have a love of British cinema, a love of British theater. Thatcher is an Atlanticist.
Yeah.
Did their early kind of cultural affinities for each other's societies have anything to do with how their relationship played out when they were head of government?
Well, I think Thatcher was a great admirer of the American system, about the American, the economy, ingenuity, enterprise, free markets, perhaps the smaller government, self-reliance. I think she's very much kind of an admirer of that sort of American way, and so I think she's in some ways trying to bring that that kind of mentality into the British culture, and of course Reagan, like for a lot of Americans, he'd love to, the British pop culture. Of course, he enjoyed being photographed, going horseback riding with the Queen. So of course that was obviously good. I'm sure it's good for him, but also for consumption for American voters too. And I think Reagan, he loved the Hasty Heart. I think was an British play he saw perform once when he was a kid. He absolutely loved that. So I think it's quite, I think absolutely, he loved British culture. Thatcher obviously fascinated by American culture. I think Thatcher also admired Lincoln as well. So I think there's lots to. I think there's obviously got an affinity towards each other's countries, and they're sympathetic towards each other's countries. And I think also got to think about as well what I tell my students is that we've got to think about the age of our leaders and how they grow up. And for Thatcher, of course, she's a child of the Second World War. So for her hero is Winston Churchill. And of course, who was Winston Churchill's main man? Franklin Roosevelt. So for her, this Anglo-American relationship is vital. far as she's concerned, for for the Western world, and for the fulfillment of her hopes and for her values and so on, especially during the Cold War. And likewise Reagan. Reagan grows up obviously poor and in Illinois, difficult home life. Goes on as you all know, goes on to be radio broadcaster, film actor, but also he's a Second World War guy. He's very much formed by the Second World War. So again, when he thinks about Britain, he's going to think about Winston Churchill. And I think there's a real lovely story in Reagan's memoir, second memoir, the American Life. And he might know those apocryphal things, like, because Reagan is the great storyteller. He says how on one of his visits to the U.K., I think probably relates to one in the 70s, in 78, where he said to someone, like Margaret Thatcher, I think she'll make a great prime minister one day. And the British person said, well, a woman prime minister? How can we, can't have that? And he says, well, the Queen called Victoria, and she did quite well, didn't she? So it's almost like, so I think there is that kind of affinity for each of us cultures, and each of us kind of like the sweep of history that they're remembering, the stories I remember as well.
So the sweep of history. In the sweep of history, where do they stand in terms of closeness and specialness of the relationship? Are they quite on the level of Churchill and Roosevelt, who also had their disagreements? Are they even more close, more intimate, somewhere farther apart? And where do they stand in relation to the last 10 years? Anglo-American relations don't seem as close as they were in the 80s.
Well, I think because the arc of history, as Barack Obama likes to talk about a lot, didn't he? I think in terms of the characters you're thinking about, in terms of comparing Reagan to Roosevelt, as Thatcher to Churchill, I think it always comes down to, in terms of as individuals, how do you compare them? And obviously, there is the strong argument that Reagan was perhaps just as transformative as Roosevelt. You have Roosevelt for the left, if you will, for like liberal America, and Reagan for conservative America. But also, for me, it's like there's different tiers of president. So I think I'm very much with like Bill Brands. I like how he explains it, where you don't want to be a great president, because to be a great president, you has to be a horror show that you've inherited. So, obviously Washington's, because he has to get it all going. Lincoln, the Civil War, and Roosevelt, because it's the Second World War. So, I'll be putting Reagan in kind of like the next tier down, which is like transform in terms of his rhetoric, the discourse, what he represents. And for Thatcher, that's the same kind of thing. I think Thatcher has a policy. She had the majority House of Commons, and she probably in some ways achieved or accomplished a lot more. But in terms of Anglo-American relations, I think obviously different circumstances, different times. I think the fact said earlier on that I think you do think about the special relation. You do think about Churchill, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Macmillan, Thatcher, Reagan, Blair, and Bush. I think that tells you how in perhaps the popular mindset that examples of when this really works and comes together. But at the same time, again, a bit like a Brandsian approach, you've got to think about the context, and that Churchill and Roosevelt were very close, and because it was the Second World War. Churchill needed the United States to join the war. He would have been anyone. He would have been, he could have been, anyone could be president. He would have been like, please, let's be friends. And likewise, Macmillan and Kennedy, where Britain is very much kind of like decline in terms of its influence and power on the global stage. But obviously Macmillan, very much sees Kennedy as a young man who he can has a good relationship with, that kind of mentoring figure with. Obviously got some commonalities with the Cold War as well in the 60s. And for Reagan and Thatcher, they've inherited again this kind of crisis, or prime economic crisis at home, and there's kind of like global political crisis abroad, where you do have the Soviet Union kind of on the march again in Afghanistan. You have this big rise into international terrorism and hostage taking and so on. So it's kind of like the events that, and then obviously Blair and Bush is the war on terror. So it's almost kind of like the events kind of bring these people together. And it's often, I've the same philosophies and some commonalities there, but obviously all the policy differences too. So in terms of the last 10 years, there has been a divergence. But again, I think it is kind of, again, goes back to politics and interests. So for instance, when Barack Obama was elected president, I remember watching the weekly Prime Minister's questions that we have in the UK, where every week, so your listeners may or may not be aware that the Prime Minister today has to go to Parliament and is held to account for questions by by members of Parliament and the Leader of the Opposition and so on. And everybody was falling over themselves to say how they're like Barack Obama, how their party is like Obama. So Gordon Brown, if memory serves, Gordon Brown would have been the Prime Minister. And he was, yes, we're doing what Obama would do. And Cameron saying, we as Conservatives, we will do what Obama would do. And Nick Clegg.
David Cameron said that.
Yeah, and Nick Clegg they were all falling over themselves, but they, like Barack Obama. And so everyone's desperate to be friends with Barack Obama. And so I remember there's a summit where Gordon Brown, there's the stories and the press, he was kind of basically chasing Obama around the building of the summit, going into the kitchen to get 5 minutes from the president. But because obviously Obama was extremely, hugely popular and remained so in Britain. Whereas George W. Bush, he was a very divisive and unpopular figure in the UK, and as was Tony Blair, especially after the war in Iraq, that when Gordon Brown replaces Tony Blair as Prime Minister in 2007, he looks so uncomfortable on the podium with George Bush because he doesn't want to be seen to be close to Bush. And likewise, obviously, you've got when Obama's president, he's much more interested in Asia and so on. He's not really that interested. You can argue, and perhaps Anglo-American's not really a high priority for him, despite the best efforts of Cameron and so on. And of course, when Donald Trump becomes president, Trump is an incredibly divisive figure, a very unpopular figure in the UK, and it's very difficult balancing that for a British Prime Minister because during the Trump administration, because of Brexit, Theresa May and then Boris Johnson had to appear in pictures and video footage, TV footage to be kind of respectful and close to the president because he's the American president and you've got to be aware that he's got people watching. And obviously he's the president, he should be treated with respect as the president of the United States, but also aware that domestically they don't want to be seen as Donald Trump. Boris Johnson doesn't want to be seen as like a Trumpian type figure. So it's really that the divergences probably happen because of events, political personalities, and probably the interesting agendas of the respective countries. But I'm reminded by Bernard Ingham, was Thatcher's press secretary. He told me in an interview where it was a wonderful interview where it's one of my first ones I ever did as a PhD student. And we went to the institute directors where Dennis first saw Ronald Reagan speak. And he was kept offering me biscuits and more tea and coffee, and it's all very lovely. And he said how when George Bush Sr. comes in as president, they do what happens. They look to Germany. Germany's the main ally. We're West Germany later, unified Germany, as the main ally in Europe. But then when they soon realise actually it's the Brits who can be relied upon. So it's almost like actually in terms of Anglo-American relations, special relationship, I think often it is events, it's interest, but there comes a moment where actually who can we, the United States, depend on or rely on? And I think no matter what's divergent disagreements going on, I think obviously you don't want necessarily anything bad to happen, but I think often when there's challenges and so on, that's kind of when it really kind of kicks in with that relationship. But the relationship endures beyond whoever's at the top, and you've got the intelligence sharing. Obviously the State Department very much in many ways kind of mirrors the Foreign Office in terms of its desk organisation. There's conversations all the time between opposite numbers and of course Brexit again is like the Northern Ireland issue is back on the agenda because Democrats in Congress will never sign a trade deal, approve a US trade deal, which jeopardises the Good Friday Agreement. So it says Northern Ireland is back on again. So Northern Ireland inflation, everything's kind of back to the 70s and the 80s in some respect. But so I think it's definitely, as I said, Harold Macmillan said, it's events to avoid events. So we should bring them close together.
So at the kind of some point throughout the 1980s, and I'd say not just some point, repeatedly it seems that other allies ask Margaret Thatcher, is there really some distance between you two? And her response always seems to be, when you're the best of friends, you can have the most serious disagreements. Mm-hmm. How does that kind of factor into your interpretation about this relationship of whether or not they were political soulmates or just interest, friends in interest and not in sentiment or in philosophy or something else?
I think she probably felt she had so much kind of credit in the bank because she's supporting so much. So over Iran-Contra scandal, she would go on TV and she'd chastise she'd be asked, what do you think about the Ronald Reagan and the scandal? And she said, how dare you ask that question? You're lucky to have President Reagan. And, it should be applauded over the phone by the cabinet. The stories about how the cabinet would all get together and clap her over the phone. And I think when it comes down to it, I think if you look at it, it's interesting how she frames the disagreements. So she would often talk to other people. So she would say she was very unhappy about the American deficit. The American was a running sore, was a running theme for her, how she was unhappy, but she wasn't the only one. Other Europeans weren't happy about this either. Because obviously the bigger the US budgetary deficit, there was due to be a connection between that and interest rates. And of course, in fact, just trying to bring down inflation and interest rates like other people are, it's difficult when the American interest rates are so high. But she'd kind of like talk to Donald T. Reagan about that. She'd say, well, your interest rates are too high. But also, if she did ever make complaints about it as well, often probably my favourite record of a meeting between Reagan and Thatcher is when she runs through a list of all the European countries. She names and shames every European country about what their faults are and what their problems are. So she talks about how, I don't know, I shouldn't even say it, disparaging, but she calls people like pains in the neck, socialists, can't be trusted, that kind of stuff. And then she said right at the end, but your interest rates are still too high, or your budget deficit is still too high. But sometimes there's moments of clear tension where Reagan leaves the room. He just leaves. So obviously, so other people kind of take the heat of it. Probably Kenneth Dam is probably rolled out so often to take the telling off before the proper meeting.
Kenneth Dam, the sacrificial lamb for Anglo-American.
Sacrificial lamb, Kenneth Dam. There's a tweet there, but yeah, it's so for Thatcher, that very much that quote you gave is very much speaks into her outlook, that you would be direct, that you would say what you think. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think obviously for Reagan, he was so. Everyone would meet you knew Ronald Reagan television like the nicest guy in the world, very amenable. So for Reagan, in some ways, probably just was quite laid back about it. He probably just could understand that, the nature of politics and how things are working out. Whereas in, say, the Carter administration, there's a note where Carter's about to meet Thatcher as Prime Minister, and it's Brzezinski. He makes a note saying she's no longer the hectoring, dogmatic woman that you met in 1975 or 1977, something like that. Yeah, it would have been 1977. And he writes, I agree. So obviously, Carter probably didn't have any time for Thatcher's approach to politics, but Reagan, he worked for Reagan. Reagan was Reagan probably liked it. Reagan probably, he wanted to know what was going. Probably wanted the direct. Because Reagan, you read how when he was governor of California, he would walk around the state house, say to his staff at 6 o'clock, go home. If you can't do what you're doing within, what you want to do in 9-10 hours, what are we all doing? So Reagan's like, we haven't got time for this. let's work and then we'll go home. So I think it just very much speaks to maybe the chemistry works.
Well, in the interest of following Reagan's example of quality time management, I'll be direct as Thatcher would be. I want to hear your favorite or the most impactful Thatcher and the most impactful Reagan quote, speech that you've come across in all your work on these two.
I think for Thatcher, I think it's she made a comment that there's no final victory in politics. So for her, it's like the constant, you have to always win that battle of ideas. And I think the fact that, history, I don't think history repeats itself, but as Mark Twain says, it rhymes a little. That things often, the wheel keeps turning, things keep, coming back again and again and again. You have to keep having the same debates over and over again. So I think the idea that even for Margaret Thatcher, first woman Prime Minister, 11 years, so the longest reigning Prime Minister of the 20th century, and probably going back to Lord Wellington, Tony Blair did his best to eclipse it, but couldn't. For her the fact that she did change Britain. Her policy, they did transform the United Kingdom. And for her said there's no final victory in politics. It's like, in some ways it's kind of like, I think it's maybe a bit of a warning or like a heads up or encouragement to people who are interested and do care about whatever side of the fence kind of something that you've got to keep on going. But something to also probably speak to some humility that maybe people don't always associate with Margaret Thatcher. But actually, she understands that, it goes on. The life goes on. For Ronald Reagan, I've got so many. Because what I like to do in my spare time, I like to look at Ronald Reagan jokes on YouTube because it's just so funny. My students just watch these things, and obviously all the speak. There's so many powerful speeches. I mean, the inaugural address. He says that government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. It's easy to forget that's quite a radical thing to say in 1981. This is a sea change. This is a big deal. But I think my favourite, and it's a story I was told by a former congressman, and he told me it's after the after Grenada when the medical students, because they're saved, and there's an event held at the White House, and apparently Reagan says that, of course, the real reason that we had to go into Grenada is because Grenada is the world's biggest supplier of nutmeg. And we had to make sure that those godless Soviets and communists did not stop the nutmeg production and supply, which would have affected eggnog for the holidays. Now, I don't know how true this is. However, what I do like about it is Reagan's whole idea that the storyteller, so the Reagan the storyteller, and how actually he can encapsulate the bigger picture of the Cold War. So I think how it actually tells these stories. I think Reagan is this kind of great communicator. There's just such wonderful things like just in his memoir and how he explains things and how he explains the world and how he sees things. And there's a story I think both tell. I think Reagan tells it, but also Thatcher I think told it as well. And it's that and other people around Thatcher time told I think it's their first summit together, where basically I think they're in Canada. I think France summit, and basically everyone's being a bit rude to Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan goes over to her and says, I'm so sorry about the men, the gentlemen and their behaviour. It's just okay, wrong, boys will be boys. It kind of brushes it away. So, and also how again in summits where they kind of look out for each other, where in the 84 election where Thatcher makes sure that US interest rates aren't really discussed. They're not in the summit to make sure he comes out with good headlines and so on. So I think so. I love Reagan's stories. I love how he explains things. I love how he tells the story, how he actually managed to encapsulate big ideas. And I think for Reagan, he's probably the best storyteller in American politics since Lincoln. I think he's up there, isn't he? And so yeah.
Jim, I think we'd agree. We can all agree on that. One more time, you can find Jim's book, A Diplomatic Meeting, Reagan, Thatcher, and the Art of Symmetry, out in stores now. We'll also make sure to link to it in the show notes. Jim, thanks a lot for being with us. Look forward to staying in touch.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.